One of the quirkiest and most intriguing of all the pivotal players was a 20th century Catholic writer of fiction from the American South. A woman whose macabre, puzzling, and luminous stories have had a transformative impact on both the church and the wider culture. A somewhat mousy, retiring figure with a thick southern drawl and crippled by a serious disease for the whole of her adult life, Flannery O'Connor was the unlikely author of some of the most shocking, violent, and unnerving stories of our time. When discussing the grotesque quality of her fiction, she said, "To the hard of hearing, you shout, and for the almost blind, you draw large and startling figures." She meant that in an age when most people had grown insensitive to the realities of the spiritual life, you had to get their attention any way you can. James Joyce, a considerably less devout Catholic than Flannery O'Connor, commented that his art consisted in the reporting of epiphanies. That is to say, moments of sudden illumination and spiritual insight. O'Connor said of her writing that it had to do with the offer of grace usually refused. If offer of grace sounds rather benign, remember that it takes place in the midst of a fallen and compromised world. O'Connor masterfully shows again and again how wrenching, therefore, the experience of grace usually is.
Even the most superficial survey of both the high and the popular culture today shows the mark of Flannery O'Connor. The comedian Conan O'Brien and the actor Tommy Lee Jones both wrote Harvard theses on her work, and her distinctive style influenced the novelists Cormac McCarthy, Alice Walker, and Walker Percy. Even Bruce Springsteen admitted that her work has significantly impacted his songwriting. But perhaps the O'Connor effect is no more evident than in the films of Joel and Ethan Coen. When I first saw their masterpiece Fargo, with its alarming blend of the absurd and the comical, the religious and the shockingly violent, I was put in mind immediately of Flannery O'Connor. And I've seen the influence since in any number of their films, from A Serious Man and True Grit to Raising Arizona and The Big Lebowski.
This is a pretty interesting picture of Flannery O'Connor.
Yeah, you look at this picture, and it's taken, that's of course Pope Pius XII, and it's taken just a few months before his death, but he's a very formal audience and surrounded by, important ecclesiastical dignitaries all in the front row in their finery. And you say, well, here are the leading figures in mid-century Catholicism. But then you just see barely peeking out right there, that little bespectacled face, and that's Flannery O'Connor, who had come to Rome for an audience. And I just love it because there's one of the most significant Catholics of the 20th century, whose influence has been as great as almost anyone else's. But there she is, and it's so typical of her. I mean, she'd never want to be in the front row. She'd never want to be, posing with the big ecclesiastics. And that's sort of her style. And it's what makes her stories, I think, so powerful. And it just catches to me an awful lot of her spirit.
Mary Flannery O'Connor was born March 25, 1925, in the lovely city of Savannah, Georgia. Her parents, Edward and Regina O'Connor, were fairly well-to-do members of an Irish Catholic community that, in that time and place, still experienced a good deal of marginalization. The young girl received a solid religious formation from the Sisters of Mercy, and she remained all her life a devout, if not ostensibly pious, Catholic.
Once, when she was 6 years old, Flannery failed to attend the required Children's Sunday Mass because her family decided to worship at a different time. When confronted by one of the sisters, the little girl stood her ground. "The Catholic Church does not dictate to my family what time I go to Mass."
Around the same age, she was, curiously enough, filmed by the Pathé Newsreel Company. For the word had gotten all the way to New York that she had managed to train an animal to do something rather peculiar.
Here's Mary O'Connor of Savannah, Georgia, holding the only chicken in the world that actually walks backwards. When she advances, she...
The filming actually didn't go very well, for the chicken refused to cooperate. But the Pathé Company played the film backwards and managed to create the illusion. This early encounter with the extraordinary bird signaled the commencement of a lifelong fascination with exotic birds, especially peafowl. When Flannery was 13, her family moved to Milledgeville, a sleepy town in the center of the state, which had been the capital of Georgia during the Civil War years. Milledgeville would be her home base for the rest of her life. When she was 15, her beloved father died of lupus, an autoimmune disease that Flannery herself would eventually contract. Devastated by the loss, the young girl moved increasingly into an interior world of fantasy and imagination. In 1942, O'Connor enrolled in what was then called the Georgia State College for Women and proved an able student as well as a gifted editor of the Corinthian, the school's literary magazine. It was in this capacity that her writer's gifts first became apparent, as well as a flair for the artistic. Somewhat in the manner of Chesterton, she contributed a cartoon to every edition of the journal and even covered the walls of the student lounge with her drawings. In 1945, Flannery received a scholarship in journalism from the State University of Iowa. During the first semester, she transferred to the well-respected program in creative writing at the university called the Iowa Writers' Workshop. Paul Engel, the director of the program at the time, recalls his first meeting with Flannery O'Connor. A shy young woman approached his desk and stood for some time without saying a word. When she finally spoke, her accent was so impenetrable to his Midwestern ear that he asked her to repeat herself. When a second attempt failed, Engel handed her a pad and pencil. She wrote down, "My name is Flannery O'Connor. I am not a journalist. Can I come to the writer's workshop?" In the heady atmosphere of the workshop, where her teachers included Robert Penn Warren and some of the other most important writers and critics of the era, she honed her craft. Her master's thesis was a collection of short fiction called The Geranium, the title story of which became her first published work. After receiving her Master of Fine Arts degree, she was accepted at Yaddo, a prestigious writers' colony in Saratoga Springs, New York, a sort of haven where writers and other artists could do their work in peace and in a supportive atmosphere. Over the years, John Cheever, Aaron Copland, Leonard Bernstein, Philip Roth, Catherine Ann Porter, and Truman Capote all spent time at Yaddo. While she was there, Flannery became friends with the poet Robert Lowell and labored to bring her first novel, Wise Blood, to completion. In 1949, she moved into an apartment over the garage at the home of Robert Fitzgerald, a scholar of the classics, and his wife Sally. These kind, intelligent, and devoutly Catholic friends provided a nurturing environment for the aspiring author. More importantly, Sally would become one of Flannery's principal correspondents. She was, like John Henry Newman, a prolific letter writer, and eventually the editor of the magnificent collection of O'Connor's missives called The Habit of Being. It was around this time that the shy but promising writer received a dinner invitation from the author Mary McCarthy and her husband. In the course of a lengthy supper at an elegant New York establishment, O'Connor barely said a word. Finally, Mary McCarthy, in an attempt to draw her out, said that though she, McCarthy, considered herself an ex-Catholic, she still had a profound respect for the Eucharist as a symbol. To which Flannery O'Connor responded in a shaky voice, "Well, if it's a symbol, to hell with it." Now, I don't know anywhere in the theological literature where you can find a better defense of what the church means when it says Jesus is really present in the Eucharist. Mind you, coming as it does from a master of symbolic literature, someone who fully understood the power of symbolism. Yet she knew that when it came to the Eucharist, she's dealing with something qualitatively different. In 1950, O'Connor was stricken with lupus, the disease that had killed her father, and she was compelled to return to Milledgeville, settling into the family farm called Andalusia on the outskirts of the town. Under her mother's care and surrounded by her beloved peacocks, Flannery lived a simple and quiet life, usually managing to work rather intensely for 2 or 3 hours a day on her writing. Despite her physical limitations, both the lupus itself and the medication she took to control it left her worn out much of the time and on crutches. She produced a fairly substantial body of work. Wise Blood, her first novel, appeared in 1952, and then in 1955, a collection of short fiction entitled A Good Man is Hard to Find, the title story of which is generally regarded as one of the literary gems of the 20th century, and which we will consider in due course. In 1960, she published a second novel called The Violent Bear It Away. And in 1965, there appeared a posthumous collection of short stories called Everything That Rises Must Converge. Even on crutches, she made a surprising number of journeys to give lectures on themes both literary and theological, many of which surface in the marvelous letters that we will examine later. One of my favorite of her one-liners was delivered on a speaking trip. "Everywhere I go," she said, "I'm asked if I think the universities stifle writers. My opinion is that they don't stifle enough of them." In the summer of 1964, the lupus, which had gone mostly into remission, returned with a vengeance. Flannery O'Connor died in Milledgeville on August the 3rd, 1964, at the age of 39.
O'Connor said that her writing had to do with, quote, the offer of grace usually refused. Why usually refused?
Yeah, it's a wonderful quote. Remember, she's a Catholic, but from the South. And so she was very grounded in Catholic theology, but also in a Protestant sensibility. Now, from the Catholic side, she's going to get a lot of talk about grace and the offer of God's grace, a kind of optimistic approach that God is always offering us a share in his life. But I would say, and this is a positive thing, from the Protestant side, she got a keen sense of sin. Of the fall. Yeah, we're built for grace, that's true, but we're compromised by the fall. We're all sinners. And so it's by a weird, perversion, we tend to go for those things that aren't good for us. There's this odd twisting of the heart, Now, Protestant theology is very good at articulating that fact, how fallen we are. So I think Flannery O'Connor combines in a wonderful way the Catholic and Protestant sensibility. So the offer of grace, yep, all the time, every day, God's offering grace. But let's be honest, it's typically refused because our minds are fallen, we don't get it, our wills are twisted, so we go the other way. Talk to anyone who's wrestled with addiction. They know exactly what this is about, right? I know I'm not supposed to drink as I take a drink. I know I'm not supposed to gamble as I go to gamble, right? Well, all sin is like that. It's an addiction. I know I'm not supposed to be this way, but yet I do it. So I think her stories and her novels catch those moments that she found very powerful, very moving, when God's grace breaks in. And often it has to break in because we're fallen, right? Because we're deaf and we're blind and we're going the wrong way. So God's grace, boom, has to break in. Now, sometimes they get it. And think of the grandmother in the Good Man's Hard to Find. I think that's a moment when someone does get it, But typically in this life, we don't get it. But what's good news? God keeps trying. God keeps trying. God keeps entering. God keeps breaking in, until finally, we hope, he'll wear us down. I've often encouraged those approaching Flannery O'Connor for the first time to begin not with her stories, but with her letters. In these magnificent missives, she appears a woman in full, smart, wickedly funny, as spiritually alert as any Catholic of the 20th century. In fact, her comments on the Catholic faith, in the words of her friend Sally Fitzgerald, shed light in every direction. A few examples might suffice to give some sense of her wit. To the poet Robert Lowell, she writes, "I bought me some peafowl and sit on the back steps a good deal studying them. I'm going to be the world authority on peafowl, and I hope to be offered a chair someday at the Chicken College." To Sally Fitzgerald, she reported this exchange between herself and her mother regarding some books that Flannery had ordered. She, Moby Dick, The Idiot. You would get something called The Idiot. What's it about? Me, an idiot. And this pithy assessment of some of her fellow writers. Mr. Truman Capote makes me plumb sick, as does Mr. Tennessee Williams. Of foreigners living, I like Frank O'Connor. I keep waiting for some club lady to ask me if I'm kin to Frank O'Connor, at which I hope to reply, I am his mother. A theme to which O'Connor returns over and again is that of the Catholic writer. An ardent student of St. Thomas Aquinas, in fact, she refers to herself as a hillbilly Thomist, she holds that grace builds on nature. This means that the first obligation of a Catholic writer is to represent the truth of things. That is to say, the world as it is, not as one might wish it to be. But the doctrine of the Church opens up new and unexpected horizons. It doesn't shut down the mind of the writer. On the contrary, it frees it to see what is really there. The Catholic writer describes the human condition, but this means a human condition marked by the fall, addressed by grace, and destined for eternal life. Again and again in her letters, Flannery says that she writes the way she does, not despite her Catholicism, but because of it.
A consistent preoccupation in her letters and essays is the incarnation, which is really the master idea of Catholicism. She observes that fiction writing, as opposed to, say, philosophical or theological writing, always has to do with particulars, with this place, with this person, with this manner of speech. When storytellers begin trading in abstractions, they tend to lose their way. Well, Flannery observed that this gives the Catholic writer a kind of advantage, precisely because the incarnation encourages a concrete, embodied approach to life. Like another Catholic novelist, David Lodge, Flannery exults in the fact that Catholic doctrine takes the physical so seriously. Think of the grittiness of the sacraments, or a feast that celebrate conception and circumcision and bodily assumption.
O'Connor also delights in the way that revelation turns things upside down. It was a commonplace among the intellectuals of her time that Catholic talk of incarnation, virgin birth, walking on water, and resurrection was naive, a holdover from a period innocent of science and hard thinking. But these miracles she held were not so much violations of the laws of nature, but rather the disclosure of the way things really are. She writes, "For me, it is the virgin birth, the incarnation, the resurrection, which are the true laws of the flesh. Death, decay, destruction are the suspension of these laws."
Why is it that the first obligation of the Catholic writer is to represent the world as it is?
Yeah, that's good, because God is truth, and the world represents God. So the forms and patterns in the world are meant to be seen by the artist as sacramental. They're reflective of God's manner of being. Just as in the moral life, we get off kilter when we start doing things that are out of step with the way God intends. We're making up our own reality. Think of, in the story of Adam and Eve, that's the symbolic way of describing this, is I become the criterion of good and evil rather than taking the patterned world that God has given. Now, put it in the artistic context. When artists start lying about things, they're not telling us the truth anymore, then they're getting further away from God. But when you look at the simplest thing, so you're an artist and you're looking at that chair, and let's say you're painting it, or you're describing it, you're a literary artist, with great precision and with great love and with great attention, you're giving honor to God by that move, because you're noticing how truth reflects the truth itself. And so there's obligation one. It's like, the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm is the first move. So as an artist, tell the truth. Represent things the way they are, and then go deeper, deeper, deeper. So don't stay with a superficial sort of realism, Flannery and I think other great artists would be uneasy with that. Oh, art just means like a photographic realism. Well, no, that might be a start. Now go deeper, deeper, deeper into reality. But at the very least, don't do any harm. Don't lie about things, and you'll be giving honor to God.
One of the most important motifs in the stories of Flannery O'Connor is the awakening to sin, and hence to one's need for a savior. She intuited that in the 20th century, perhaps the greatest block to Christianity was precisely a spiritual complacency. A sense that all in us is basically in order. But when this attitude is internalized, Jesus necessarily devolves to the level of teacher or inspiring hero and ceases to be savior.
Hence the moment, necessarily painful, when grace breaks through our defenses, is an epiphany worth describing. To my mind, the best presentation of this breakthrough in O'Connor's writings is the pithy, funny, and deeply troubling story called, appropriately enough, Revelation.
The narrative begins with the entry of Mr. and Mrs. Turpin into a doctor's crowded waiting room. The place is filled with sick people, but the plump and self-possessed Mrs. Turpin is not one of them. She is quick to tell everyone that it's her husband who has the appointment.
As the story progresses, Flannery allows us to hear two conversations. The outer one that Mrs. Turpin is having with the other denizens of the waiting room, and the inner one that she's having with herself. On the outside, everything is warm and pleasant and generous. But on the inside, Mrs. Turpin is fiercely judging everybody in the room.
When a lady tells her that she had bought some jewelry with green stamps, Mrs. Turpin says to herself, "Ought to have got you a wash rag and some soap." When a young woman, slouching in the corner, is described as having been to college up north, Mrs. Turpin thinks to herself, well, it hasn't done much for her manners. All of this comes to a head when Mrs. Turpin utters a soliloquy of gratitude for all the gifts that God had given her. If it's one thing I am, it's grateful. When I think who all I could have been besides myself and what all I got, I just feel like shouting, "Thank you, Jesus. for making everything the way it is. With that, a book hits her directly over her left eye.
It had been thrown by the scowling college girl who is now on Mrs. Turpin, her fingers digging into the soft flesh around our hero's throat. The doctors, the nurses, the attendants spring into action. They pull the girl off of Mrs. Turpin. They administer a sedative. But before slipping into unconsciousness, the young woman fixes Mrs. Turpin with a fierce stare. The older woman realizes that the frightening figure before her knows her in some personal and intense way.
Both fascinated and terrified, Mrs. Turpin sputters, "What you got to say to me?" Continuing to stare into Mrs. Turpin's face with awful concentration, the girl says, "Go back to hell where you came from, you old warthog." Despite the horrified protests of the denizens of the waiting room, Mrs. Turpin realizes, in some uncanny but definitive way, that the girl is right. The words of the unmannered college student carried the force of a revelation. As the unconscious girl is being carried away, we understand the power of her name: Mary Grace.
Like the Pharisee in Jesus' famous parable, who thanked God for making him not like other men, Mrs. Turpin exulted in her moral superiority. In fact, it was upon that sense that her whole relationship to God was based. Like a tortoise or a terrapin, how like Turpin, she had encased herself in a protective shell. The needful thing was a breakthrough, and it was provided through the ministrations of Mary Grace. In a fallen world, God's love is typically experienced in this interruptive, even violent way. O'Connor's stories compel us to look with the eyes of faith precisely at these unnerving moments.
What we see at the close of the story is that Mrs. Turpin's revelation has in fact prompted a decisive change. Standing alongside the hog pen on her farm, how like the prodigal son who had fallen to the point of working among the pigs, Mrs. Turpin looks up and spies a curious purple streak. As a visionary light sparkles in her eyes, she saw the streak as a vast swinging bridge extending upward from the earth. Upon it, a vast horde of souls were rumbling toward heaven. There were whole companies of white trash, clean for the first time in their lives. Battalions of freaks and lunatics shouting and clapping and leaping like frogs.
And taking up the rear of the procession of the Blessed were people like her husband and herself, proper and dignified. But she saw, and the story ends with this luminous observation, by their shocked and altered faces, that even their virtues were being burned away. We recall Jesus' admonition to the Pharisees. "Amen, I say to you, the tax collectors and prostitutes are entering the kingdom of heaven before you." He's not saying that the self-righteous will never get in, but he's certainly implying that those who acknowledge their need for salvation are walking the privileged path.
You know, reading Revelation is a little bit uncomfortable because I think all of us recognize ourselves a bit in Mrs. Turpin character.
And that's the idea, isn't it? I mean, she intuited something that you find in Jesus himself, namely, those who are in the worst spiritual shape are not sinners who know it, It's sinners who don't know it, right? Sinners who think they're righteous are in much worse spiritual condition than someone who's a sinner, knows it, and approaches the divine mercy. Think of the Pharisee and the publican parable of Jesus, right? The proud Pharisee that, oh Lord, I'm so grateful I'm not like other people. Then there's the poor tax collector in the back of that barely raises his head and, Lord, have pity on me. Well, that person goes home righteous, Jesus says. So Mrs. Turpin is a version of the Pharisee that, I'm convinced of my own righteousness. These poor people, God help them, Well, she's in much worse, much more precarious spiritual position, which is why she needs the breakthrough of grace. And of course, Flannery O'Connor is the master of that sort of description. But I think in the measure that you do recognize yourself in Mrs. Turpin, that's a good thing. In itself, that's a breakthrough of grace. Most of us spend our time, looking down on other people and judging them. And especially, the danger is the more religious you are, the more adept you become at using the law and so on to judge people. Like, well, I know the way you're supposed to be living, and clearly you're not. So that's the great danger of all spiritual people. But I think she, like all the great spiritual masters, intuited that. And it's a story that is therefore of universal, relevance.
The story, generally regarded as Flannery O'Connor's masterpiece, is called A Good Man is Hard to Find. Moody, suspenseful, darkly comic, violent, and brimming with theological and spiritual wisdom, this tale is a pure distillation of her distinctive art. There is a recording of Flannery herself reciting this story aloud. Once you've heard her voice, I would defy you to unhear it as you read the tale.
The story I'm going to read tonight is called A Good Man is Hard to Find.
It commences with a warning. A grandmother tells her son, Bailey, and his family they oughtn't to go on a planned vacation trip to Florida, since the newspapers say an escaped convict called the Misfit is headed there. He's been known to do terrible things. They ignore her, as it seems they usually do, and they set out on the journey.
The grandmother dressed carefully for the trip, decking herself out in a jaunty hat and an elegant navy blue dress, so that, as Flannery writes, in case of an accident, anyone seeing her dead on the highway would know that she's a lady. Arriving at an eating establishment run by a certain Red Sammy Butts, they settle into their lunch. When June Starr, one of her grandchildren, says something rude to Red Sammy's wife, the grandmother hisses to her,
Aren't you ashamed?
The proprietor commiserates with her and both conclude,
A good man is hard to find.
In a few deft strokes, Flannery has sketched the character of the grandmother. She's not unlike Mrs. Turpin, sure of her own righteousness and convinced of the depravity of the world around her. As far as she's concerned, good people are just pretty thin on the ground.
As they continue on their journey, the grandmother recalls a lovely house that she had known in her youth, and she waxes so lyrically about it that she convinces her son, against his better judgment, to go off the road and search it out. On the way down a bumpy country lane, the grandmother, to her horror, suddenly remembered that the house in question was in fact in another state. Alarmed, she kicks her valise, which upsets a basket in which their cat had been snoozing. The animal leaps up onto Bailey's shoulder, and he loses control of the car, sending the vehicle into a somersault and landing them in a ditch by the side of the road. This entire drama has been witnessed from a distance. Soon a car approaches, and 3 men emerge, apparently to offer help. When the grandmother sees the driver of the car, she's convinced that she knows him, but she can't quite place him. Then, in a flash, she realizes who it is. And before she could catch herself, she blurts out,
You're the misfit. I recognize you at once.
With a dreadful matter-of-factness, he drawls,
But it would have been better for all of you ladies if you hadn't recognized me.
As her son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren are led one by one into the forest to be shot, the grandmother and the misfit engage in a deadly serious theological conversation.
Do you ever pray, she asked?
He shakes his head no. When he speaks of years of mistreatment in prison, including solitary confinement, she eagerly suggests,
That's when you should have started to pray.
if you would pray, Jesus would help you. He agrees with her in principle, but he adds,
I don't want no help. I'm doing all right by myself.
Here we see that despite their enormous differences at the superficial level, the grandmother and the misfit are actually in the same spiritual space, secure in the conviction of their self-sufficiency. But then their conversation takes a decisive and finally saving Christological turn.
hearing the gunshots in the distance and knowing that her family is being put to death, the grandmother stands in the ditch muttering, Jesus, Jesus. And the misfit takes the cue.
Yes, what the misfit said as if he agreed. Jesus thrown everything off balance.
This is the profoundest theological remark in the story, the hinge upon which the narrative turns. The hardened criminal is expressing something of central importance in the Christian tradition, namely that Jesus is the judge. That means the one who takes an off-kilter world and sets it right. Here's how the misfit, displaying remarkable theological acumen, puts it. Jesus was the only one who ever raised the dead. He shouldn't have done that. He'd thrown everything off balance.
Jesus' victory over sin and death has made all the difference. If you believe in it, you live in a transformed world. Therefore, Jesus compels a choice. Here again is the remarkably profound Christology of the misfit.
If he did what he said, then it's nothing for you to do but throw away everything and follow him. And if he didn't, then it's nothing for you to do but enjoy the few minutes you got left the best way you can. By killing somebody or burning down his house or doing some other meanness to him. No pleasure but meanness, he said.
In her shock and confusion, the old lady mutters,
Maybe he didn't raise the dead.
and the killer pounces on the suggestion with enthusiasm.
I wasn't there, so I can't say he didn't, the misfit said. I wish I'd have been there, he said, hitting the ground with his fist. It ain't right I wasn't there, because if I had been there, I would have known. Listen, lady, he said in a high voice, if I had been there, I would have known, and I wouldn't be like I am now.
In uttering those words, the misfit signals a major spiritual transformation. Just moments before, he had assured the grandmother he needed no help. Now he acknowledges that all is far from right with him. Further, he admits that it's Jesus' conquest of death that would make all the difference in his life, changing him from someone who takes pleasure in cruelty to someone willing to throw everything away and follow Christ. When the misfit spoke those words, his voice seemed about to crack. And in that moment, the grandmother's head cleared for an instant. Looking the misfit directly in the eye, she murmured,
Why, you're one of my babies. You're one of my own children.
At the outset of the story, one couldn't have imagined a less likely scenario. But now, in the awful pressure of the moment, and having heard the misfit confess his weakness, she realizes her own frailty and that both of them are sinners in need of mercy. Overcome with a feeling of compassion, the old lady reaches out and touches the misfit on the shoulder. But the killer reacts violently to the touch, springing back as if a snake had bitten him, and shooting the grandmother 3 times through the chest.
This climactic resolution of the conversation is not, all indications of the contrary notwithstanding, entirely tragic. For in Flannery O'Connor's universe, physical death is hardly the worst of fates. Having seen what she was meant to see, namely her solidarity in sin with the worst of sinners, and having thereby opened herself to grace, the grandmother was ready for heaven. Indeed, in death, and I'm quoting directly here from the story, she sits in a puddle of blood, her legs crossed under her like a child's, her face smiling up at the cloudless sky. Strangely enough, she had recovered her innocence and found her joy.
Having shot the old woman, the misfit put his gun down on the ground and took off his glasses and began to clean them. Just as the old lady's head had cleared in her moment of identification with the killer, so now the misfit's vision is being clarified. But what does he see? As Bobby Lee, one of the misfit's associates, comes to take away her body, he says,
She was a talker, wasn't she?
and the misfit responds, in undoubtedly the most famous line in the story,
She would have been a good woman if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life.
he sees that she understood something of enormous significance. That grace, in the typically terrible O'Connor manner, had broken through. But then Bobby Lee, still exulting in the excitement of the killing, exclaims, "Some fun!" And the misfit, in the grace-filled final line of the story, responds,
Shut up, Bobby Lee. It's no real pleasure in life.
Earlier, the misfit had proposed the stark Kierkegaardian either-or. Either you give your whole life to Christ, or you find whatever pleasure you can in killing or some other act of meanness. In admitting that his life as he's currently leading it is giving him no pleasure, is the misfit at least signaling an openness to the only other viable option. Now, was it the grandmother's evocation of the holy name? Was it her reaching out to him in compassion? Who knows? But grace was offered. In fact, grace is always on offer, but we have to have clear eyes to see it.
So her father died of lupus, and then she, O'Connor, got lupus at such a young age. How did that affect her work?
Well, I think it massively affected her work. Remember the line from A Good Man's Hard to Find, when they comment that the old lady would have been a good woman if there'd just been someone to shoot her every day of her life. And the point is, if she was brought every day to this point of ultimate concern and ultimate decision, she would have been a good woman. Well, see, in a way, Flannery O'Connor lived for most of her adult life with someone holding a gun to her head. I mean, because she knew she was going to die of this disease sooner rather than later. And that gave a great intensity to her life and to her writing. Her writings are in a way Kierkegaardian because they're about this decision. You make a decision for grace, or do you say no to grace? That everything else is a footnote. The things that we're concerned about of our wealth and power and our status in society, who cares in a way? Because we're all going to die. We all have a gun to our head in a way. So making the decision for or against grace, that's what matters. Everything else is a footnote.
Why is Flannery O'Connor a pivotal player? In the middle of the 20th century, which witnessed more death, despair, and tyranny than any other century on record, she had the courage to show just how dark are the hearts of fallen human beings. But at the same time, she had the incomparable grace to demonstrate how God continues to work even on that bleak and blasted ground.
If I might make bold to compare her to Dante, she manages within the confines of her carefully crafted short stories to take her readers through hell, purgatory, and heaven. It was precisely because she believed so passionately in the divine mercy that she was able to look so unblinkingly at human depravity. And perhaps here we can see why she was such a great comic writer. If, as Chesterton said, the essence of humor is the coming together of incongruous things, in a way there's nothing funnier than the juxtaposition of sin and grace that she was able to describe with such deftness of touch.
Thomas Merton, just months after O'Connor's death, wrote a lovely elegy which contains these lines. When I read Flannery, I don't think of Hemingway or Catherine Ann Porter or Sartre, but rather someone like Sophocles. What more can be said of a writer? I write her name with honor for all the truth and all the craft with which she shows man's fall and his dishonor.